Hello, dear guests and dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to everybody of you. We are 20 people now, and we are very happy to have all of you today. So many of you are here from all around the world, but it's not all around the world. Mostly of us are from Germany here. And we have a guest from Switzerland and guests from China, Beijing, Xinjiang, and Shanghai. Welcome to everybody. And this is the URBANIX alumni project in the field of urbanization from China Center, Technische Universität Berlin, welcome you to our first China Lunch in this semester called Rurban China Lunch. So why Rurban? In this season of China Lunches, we are looking at rural-urban relations in China today. For the whole season, we have invited 3 excellent researchers. Ava Lynam, she will present her research today. In June, we have Ahmadjan Ruzi from Beijing. Hello, Ahmadjan. And in July, we have Lena Kaufmann from Zurich. All 3 are here today, which makes us very, very happy. Welcome to you. And we are looking forward to exciting discussion afterwards. How is this season organized today? Kim, please, the next slide. My colleague Kim Beze will briefly introduce our project to you. Afterwards, I will lead over to Mrs. Lynam's presentation and briefly introduce her and her work. After the presentation of about 30 to 35 minutes, we hope to have a vivid discussion with you about her lecture and research in this field of socio-spatial typologies of mobility of the floating population in China's industrializing hinterland. So this is the title also of Ava's presentation today. What is China Lunch and why we call it lunch? In every invitation for our lectures, you will also find our suggestion for making a delicious Chinese vegetarian dish, a recipe that should help you to prepare this meal at home. In the past, we used to meet in the university and eat together after the discussion and lecture, and unfortunately, we can no longer do this together. But each of you can prepare the food at home and enjoy it after the lecture. It creates a sense of community and togetherness. China Lunches help us to talk about many important topics regarding China and urbanization, and to exchange and get to know each other better. So Kim will now introduce to you our URBANIX project. Please, Kim.
Yes, hi, and welcome to Rurban China Lunch. We are very happy to have you here, and that Ava is going to tell us more about her research today. Instead of talking too much, I would love to show you our short image film, which has been done by our great colleague, Paul. And yeah, please enjoy. Yeah, so this is our team. You can see us 4 here today. Mrs. Abbas, Mrs. Jo Humming, and Tanya Becker, they are our researchers, and Paul and me, we are a student assistant. Okay, now we are going to introduce you, Ava. I think we don't need the presentation anymore because, yeah, we are happy to have you here directly.
Oh, thank you, Kim. So let me pin. I pinned you, and now wait a moment, and we pin our guest today, Ava Lynam. So let me, Ava, introduce you in a few words. Ava Lynam is an urban researcher, designer, and writer, primarily working in the field of urban sociology and global urban studies. She completed the International Master of Science Urban Management program at Technische Universität Berlin. She holds previous degrees in architecture from the University in Nottingham and urban design from the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL London. Ava has experience living and working in Southeast Asia, having grown up in this region. Ava is also our colleague. She joined the China Center as a research assistant in January this year. She works in the project Urban Rural Assessment. A part of this huge project deals with urban rural migration, social mobility, and inclusion. For this part of the project is Ava responsible. Her research interests lie in the fields of urban sociology, co-productive planning approaches, land dynamics, and rural urbanization processes. Ava works in the Urban Rural Assessment Project as a researcher, coordinator, and a PhD candidate. The title of today's presentation, Socio-spatial typologies of mobility of the floating population in China's industrializing hinterland, describes already Ava Lynam's current research. So Ava, please, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I'll just, 1 second, I'll just share my screen. Can you all see the screen already?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tanya and Kim and the whole Urbanics team for the very kind invitation to speak today. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting to know the Urbanics network and also joining the talks of the next speakers in the series. So thank you all. As Tanya already introduced, I'm going to talk a little bit about a sort of, it's kind of an ongoing research project, and it draws quite heavily from my master's thesis project, which I completed about a year ago in February 2020. And I was a part of the Urban Rural Assembly project. And then, as Tanya mentioned, I started working at the China Center. So I'm sort of framing my project I did for my master's thesis in the context of this new focus on mobility and migration. So to give a little context, I think I'll just be very brief here because I think everyone here is already is very interested in China and already is very well aware of China's very profound transformation since the economic reform of 1978 in the last decades, really transitioning from a very rural agricultural society with a low urbanization rate of under 18%. To one in which about 60% of the country is considered urbanized. And what I want to highlight here in the context of this presentation is that this rapid urban expansion, one of the main drivers of this has been migration, both inter and intra-provincial migration. And they have these floating population, so-called floating population, has been moving a lot from the inland regions towards the coastal regions in these industrial agglomerations. And these industrial agglomerations, which I don't know if you can see my mouse, but along here on the East Coast, this is where a lot of the migration was drawn to in the last decades. And this has created or transitioned China from being a relatively immobile society to one in which 20% of the population is considered to be a migrant. And as I mentioned, this term floating population, this is a one of the many terms used to describe this social group of migrant in the Chinese context. I'm using this term today because it refers to migrants who do not hold local household registration. And I'll get to that on the next slide. But I want to stress that this is really a large group of people. It's estimated to be around 240 million people. And this social group is also highly mobile, moving from province to province, seeking income opportunities, affordable housing, as well as connecting in with existing social networks. But they're also hindered from settling down due to various constraints, such as working conditions, social barriers, and institutional constraints. So these processes have also created quite a severe urban-rural divide in the last decades. As I mentioned, institutional constraints play a large role in this process of segregation. So the household registration system that I mentioned is called HUCO, the HUCO system, and it divides public service access between urban and rural populations. And it's very difficult to convert, especially rural HUCO into urban HUCO. So this becomes a big problem for rural migrants living in urban areas and then do not have the same access to public services such as education, also access to employment. And it's been established since 1954 with the main aim to sort of immobilize the large rural population in China. And there have been several reforms, but I think still today, the main focus is on controlling internal migration, population governance, and also as a way of or a tool to direct urbanization processes. And it's been estimated that there's around 16% of the urban population that do not hold urban HUCO and thus are not entitled to the same public services as their counterparts who do hold urban HUCO. It's a very complex subject, so I'm just giving a very brief overview. And what I also want to mention is that this floating population tends to be drawn towards urban-rural interface areas, which are characterized by socioeconomic disparities, also fragmented land uses, mixing industrial and agricultural land uses side by side, and as I mentioned, unequal service distributions. And this problem of urban-rural polarization was really highlighted in the 2000s, since the early 2000s, especially around the topic of food security, concerns that agricultural land was being taken up by urbanization processes. So since 2014 in particular, there's been a new type, the so-called new type urbanization plan introduced. And the main aims of this sort of new form of urbanization or sustainable urbanization is that it would move towards urban-rural development integration and be a more people-oriented form of urbanization. And a big part of this plan is to implement another or more genuine form of HUCO reform. And it was still used, or the vision or the aim was still to use the HUCO reform as a way of increasing the urban population to 60% by 2020 and granting 100 million urban residents who do not hold local HUCO, urban HUCO. So the idea is that it would slowly transition towards a system based around a national residence permit, where it's based around a point-based system, and these points control your access to services. So you can get points based on your education, your skills, for example, and also the length of time that you've spent in an urban area. And research has shown that public service inequality has narrowed to some extent, but in general, it's been criticized as really still focusing on population control over genuine concerns of social equality. And these reforms have also sort of changed the flows of migration, or are starting to change the flows of migration, or are predicted to. So in the East Coast, which I mentioned is a heavily urbanized area and is really this space of manufacturing and industrialization, there is increased automation happening in the manufacturing industry, and that's also diverting the flows towards inland provinces, which have lower land and labor costs, for example. And this HUCO reform also runs the risk of increasing intercity inequality, because the first tier cities, or the highest populated cities such as Shanghai, have extremely high restrictions in order to convert your HUCO. And this means that although it would still have the highest inflows of migrant workers, they would be the most highly educated migrant workers. And then second and third tier cities would have lower restrictions, and they would be competing for the lower skilled workers. So this is creating another sort of layer of segregation or new hierarchies in terms of migrant selectivity. And another issue is that many of this so-called floating population is living without the required documentation, so they have no way to prove that they have lived in an area for a certain amount of time, and therefore are not able to obtain this resident permit. So to just briefly describe my theoretical framework, it's a multi-scalar theoretical framework starting at the macro scale with the notion that we are shifting towards a predominantly urbanized world based around planetary urbanization. And in this context, urban-rural interface areas in particular are becoming sites of translocal networks of global industrialization. Rural areas are being absorbed by urban areas. And in this context of the sort of hybrid, a very hybrid condition at urban-rural interface areas, we can no longer really use these binary categorizations of urban and rural. They become increasingly irrelevant, and we need a sort of new categorizations to really understand the conditions on the ground. And then on the other scale of things, on the micro scale, I looked at the notion of everyday urbanization. So already since the 60s, sociologists such as Henri Lefebvre have been discussing or conceptualizing the social production of space through the sort of everyday, repetitive, mundane practices of inhabitants. And what I find most interesting is this focus away from urban form towards actual urbanization processes, and also that they were calling for really this multi-scalar lens to understanding planetary urbanization processes and how they interact with one another. So one type of everyday practice, the one that I focused on, is the activity of the home or the practice of dwelling. And I used Lefebvre's spatial triad, which is a framework for understanding the social production of space based around 3 different elements. So, and they each interact with one another. So on the social layer, you have everyday practices. This is the lived sphere. On the physical side, this is the sort of material reality or the physical outcome of the everyday practices. And in between, you have the mental sphere, which is the kind of interface between the two, the struggle between the top-down planning processes and everyday practices, that it's in constant negotiation, and it refers to sort of the principles that govern the way that individuals perceive their social world. And in order to use this or conceptualize my own categories that I would use for my methodology, I came up with 3 different scales. So firstly, it's the private scale, which looks at very micro scales, such as the house would be the sort of material space I would look at. And everyday practices would be really private practices such as sleeping, cooking, eating, for example. And in terms of interface, it's looking at top-down housing developments, also land acquisition processes. On the collective scale, it would be the street or kind of vacant space. And in terms of everyday practices, really focus on social activities and exchange between different actors. And in terms of interface, it would be sort of formalized public spaces and restrictions and regulations on these exchanges and social activities. On the institutional level, the material space would be institutional public buildings, everyday practices would be sort of religious, cultural, or political gatherings, and the interface would be public provided infrastructure and structural constraints. And this diagram helps me to, it was conceptualized by my colleague, Dr. Huang, who was working on the project, was leading the work in the China Center before me. But I find it really helpful in sort of framing the work that I did for my master's thesis within this concept of mobility or immobility, because mobility is sort of divided into two main dimensions. So on the physical side, you have distributions of housing, public space, for example. And on the social side, you have things like institutional barriers that I mentioned before, language and social networks, and also access to public space or education. So my main research questions that came out of all of this was, you know, how do everyday practices of the floating population interact with top-down urbanization visions in Huangyan-Taizhou? What hybrid uses, actor networks, and spatial typologies are generated at the urban-rural interface? And what do these typologies reveal about wider patterns of mobility and immobility? And then this is the way that I, just very briefly, how I use those interacting layers or the spatial triad to develop my own methodology. So on the mental layer, I did an in-depth policy analysis of a rural urbanization policy. On the social layer, I conducted semi-structured interviews and participant observation during a 1-month period of fieldwork. And then on the physical layer, I identified 9 comparative typological studies. So then to get to my case study, so I'm really looking at, as I mentioned, this one example of a case. It's considered to be a sort of ordinary second-tier city that is in the Yangtze River Delta in Zhejiang province here. It's quite an affluent coastal province. It is known for having a large number of floating populations. It's also known for being the sort of so-called the birth of the private sector development in the country. And I'm looking here at, this is Zhejiang province, and this is the prefecture level city of Taizhou, which is sort of known as the city of mountain and sea. So it's a quite mountainous region. It has it's an agglomerated urban region of about 6 million people. And it has a very high economic performance and strong industrial base. And it's also located at a very key point within the Yangtze River Delta, about 3 hours south of Shanghai on the high-speed train. And in terms of migratory flows, it's estimated that there's around 100,000 members of this so-called floating population within Taizhou. This is a diagram that was made by my colleague Lucas Utzig, but I find it really helpful in seeing really where these flows are coming from. And it really shows that they are coming mostly from provinces such as Anhui or Henan that are less economically developed inland provinces rather than more highly populated and wealthier agglomerations within the Yangtze River Delta. And it's also interesting to note that in more recent years, there's been more out migrants than in migrants, and this is likely to be due to the increased production automation in the region. Zooming in a bit further, here on the top, this is Huangyan district. It's one of the 3 urban districts within Taizhou. It has a very long established molding industry in the area, I think around 60 or 70 years. It's currently undergoing industrial upgrading processes. And I find it quite interesting that it's considered an urban region, because when you look at it, you can clearly see that actually a vast amount of this region or this area in the Huangyan district is really mountainous, and it doesn't appear to be urban at all. But you can really see how the urban area is creeping in. And this area here that I'm focusing on is really in this urban-rural interface area. And this is a zoom in of this urban-rural interface area. The specific area that I'm looking at, but also the whole urban-rural assembly project, is also very interested in this particular area, because it really brings together this sort of agricultural production with industrial zones around here, which is really on the hinterland of the historic city center. And And I'm looking at an example of a rural urbanization program, a rural revitalization development strategy called the Characteristic Town, which was introduced in 2017. And it's really based around this one town, one industry mode of development. So you have a lot of them were developed in Zhejiang province. In fact, I think the first ones were developed there. And you have some quite amusing examples of this characteristic town. For example, a town that only produces chocolate, a town that only produces lingerie. You also have ones that have a cultural orientation, such as a traditional Chinese opera town. And the aim really is to promote rural economic development. And when I was doing my policy review, I identified three kind of contradictions. So firstly, it mentioned many times people-oriented urbanism, but I found that it's been criticized quite a lot for still retaining this dominance of top-down governance approaches. And the second one was that it would kind of be this inside out mode of development through the specialized industry. But again, it's been criticized as actually promoting local exclusion. And then on the third point that's mentioned several times is nurturing of tradition and culture by embracing local conditions. And what I found is that there's been criticism that in fact, these projects often treat the existing site as a sort of blank slate, rather than really being sensitive towards the local conditions. So the example that I'm looking at here in Huangyan, in the urban-rural interface, is an industry-led example of a characteristic town called the Smart Molding Town. And the idea is that it would draw on the existing molding production in the area, but it would really lead the area in its industrial upgrading processes. So here in the center here is an area of less than 3.5 kilometers squared. And it agglomerates around 30 smart molding enterprises. And the notion or the idea behind it is that it would combine industry with culture and tourism. So the idea was that it would not just be an industrial park, but also bring tourists to the area, and there would be sort of expos, but also a mold sculptural park and a greenway. So it's a new vision for industry in the area. What I find quite interesting is in this render image, it really looks as if it sort of landed on an empty site with no context, but in fact, there's several existing villages around the area, and within the policy document, it's mentioned that the aim is to promote economic development of the existing villages with agricultural tourism. But at least what I can see from this image is that the villages no longer exist somehow. So I'm not sure. I can really see a conflict there. And now just getting to my empirical investigation. So on the ground, when I was able to do the field work, I found that the majority of villagers have their lives in some shape or form impacted by the molding industry. And this could be a family member working in the industry. It could be that they had their farmland taken in the processes of farmland acquisition to provide profitable land for rental to factories. It could also be that they have a household industry where they are working informally in the molding production line, for example, packaging small plastic goods on a very small scale. And entire villages are actually reliant on this industry, especially with this land rental to factories. It's a very lucrative source of income for village collectives. And the result is that the urban-rural interface area really has this mix of fragments of agriculture, production, and high-density residential being built. And I think here, this image, this aerial image, you can really see these fragments coming together. You have this access road that's been built for the smart molding town, and this gridded, this is one of the new rural developments that's being built and is slowly replacing the existing fabric. and this is a factory. So you can really see how they are really, it's like a patchwork of different land uses. And this image here, this is the smart molding town sort of looming behind the agricultural uses. So it is really this strong interface between the industry and the agriculture. And this is a sort of zoomed in image showing the smart molding town in the center and the 6 villages that I conducted my empirical investigation in. So on the right-hand side here, you have Shifan village, which is the most urbanized village and has been sort of engulfed by the existing urban area. It's been developed into quite a strong local urban core and also an industrial area. And then on the other end, you have, for example, Singto village, which is a very different condition. It's not very accessible. The people there are, well, they tend to be in the older generations and they still farm more than those in the other more urbanized villages, and it's much smaller scale and less developed. And these sort of colorful dots, these are the different typologies that I identified, and I will just show you 3 today. This is just very briefly showing or highlighting the different typologies that exist in the area. So in terms of residential typologies, I mentioned this very rigid, gridded, new rural housing typology. You also have these a few high-rise urban gated communities that are being developed. And then these 2 are the sort of the older, more organically developed rural fabric, where you have rural stone and timber housing, but also these kind of terraced rural housing from the 80s and the noughties. And then with these industrial typologies, you have the old industrial fabric, which is very gridded and very bare, and then the smart molding town, which includes, these new formalized green spaces and is much more elaborately designed. And then in terms of landscape, you have farmland next to these very urbanized, urban style formalized landscapes. These are some examples on the private dwelling scale of dwelling typologies which were used by the floating population. So there are examples, of course, of factory dormitories. You have informal extensions to existing buildings, which are officially illegal, but you really see them everywhere. And then in the new rural housing developments, which can be quite elaborate, you could find that rooms had been subdivided and rented to migrant workers as well as garage spaces. And this, again, is officially not allowed, but it's really quite common. And then on driveways, you have sort of converted container housing as well. And this is one example that I would like to show you to sort of illustrate these conditions at the urban-rural interface. This typology, it's a small single-story rural rental house, which is in the village I mentioned, Singto, which is one of the least developed villages. And in there was living an old couple who were both retired officially, and they were living with their young granddaughter. And the husband, although he was retired officially, he was working informally as a waste collector. And this particular house is really located only about 150 meters from the smart molding town. So you could even hear the factories from this location. And they had arrived from Anhui province in, I think, about two months previously. And they're a really long-term migrant family. They had been moving in several places over the last 10 years. And the reason they moved to this area is because one of their sons lives, well, they have 2 sons. One of them lives in the urban area of nearby, and the other one lives about 2 hours drive away. And the one that lives about 2 hours drive away has their daughter here living in this house. So it was interesting to see how the family they weren't able to find suitable accommodation to live together. They had to sort of split up in different geographic locations, and that was their strategy. And these are some images of the house here, and you can really see how the smart molding town in the background is really close to this house. And also the woman, her main concerns was that the condition of the house was not really suitable for bringing up a child. She also mentioned that there was no place for the child to play in the area. This was quite interesting to note because just around the corner, another local grandmother had built their own playground in front of the house, which really became like a node of activity for the neighbors. But this grandmother was actually not aware of it. So that sort of hinted that she didn't really, or she wasn't well connected with her neighbors. But at the same time, she mentioned that several people from her hometown province were living in the area, and this connection with language really helped her make social connections. And on the collective level, there are places like the local farmers market where you have all sorts of people coming together. You also have this example of a workers' barbecue restaurant, which had sort of popped up. It was built by a local villager who had gotten some compensation for losing her farmland, and she'd built this barbecue restaurant in the factory quarter, and it was really popular with the factory workers. And they would come several times a day. And she also planned, she'd built a stage, so she had plans for karaoke and movie screenings, and it really became like a social space in the area. This is the grandmother's playground that I mentioned, and also in sort of vacant space, you would have, it's very common to see sort of small scale household farming activities still popping up. So this example is in the more urbanized village, in Shifan village. It's a vacant lot that exists between quite a new, still being constructed new rural housing development and a line of factories. And half of this plot was under construction. There was a wall being built, and the other half had a sort of quite a few spontaneous farming plots that had popped up there. And we met this man who was tending to one of the plots. And it was quite interesting because he looked as if, and based on his appearance, first impression, looked as if he was a local farmer. But he then revealed that he actually lived in a high-rise gated community right next to this plot with 6 bedrooms and 8 family members. And he was an ex-farmer, and he'd moved to the area around 3 years previously and had no intention of changing or attempting to change his hukou to urban hukou, because he really saw it as a temporary arrangement. And he'd come to look after his grandchildren, and his son and his daughter-in-law had come to the area, I think it was 8 years ago, and they'd managed to set up their very own molding enterprise, which was quite successful, and they had 40 employees. And here are some photos of the site that he was farming on, the factories in the background, and this is the gated community that he lived in. So what's interesting to note is that these new urban style developments don't have any space for especially the older generation to do things like household farming. And it's interesting that this family lives in this very urbanized environment, but they're still really dependent on this small-scale farming practices, and they are using this produce in their everyday life as well. On the institutional layer, you have things like the greenway that was built by the Smart Molding Town, and it was noted to be quite a well-used space for all different kinds of people in this area. you also have different institutional buildings for different social groups. So you have the migrant housing services building, for example, but then you have other buildings such as the senior home, which was not accessible to the floating population. You also have illegal workshops, which are formalized by the village collectives, and they also provide work for the floating population. And you also have things like night schools, which are providing a space where children can do their homework in the evening. And this example was really in this factory complex. The school itself was was in the same building as the factories were. And this sort of provides a space for families who have long working hours, and they don't have the ability to help their children with homework at home. This is the last example. Also in Shifan village, the more urbanized village, it's an area that had, I was sort of thinking of it as a kind of institutional quarter in the village. You had this office for the housing for migrant workers, a temple, and a very formalized public space, shaded public space. And it's really overlooked by the institutional buildings. And it is very well used by lots of different people in the area. Lots of different people who have a migration background were gathering in this area, especially children and mothers. And the woman, one of the people that we spoke to there, this woman, she was a young woman who had moved to the area. She was only about 20 or 25, moved to the area to be with her husband, who'd lived in the area, I think, since he was a teenager, but also came from the same province of Guizhou. And she came with her young daughter of about 2 years old. And she described how her husband had really he was an example of someone who is really benefiting from this molding industrial upgrading. So he was undergoing a training program where he was learning programming skills. And she said that his salary would be doubled once he was done. And interestingly, they had no intention of staying in the area. They planned to just save money and go back to their hometown and set up a family business. Also interesting to note is that this family lived in one of these new rural housing developments, which officially should not be rented to the migrant workforce. But the woman explained how her father-in-law had personal connections, and that's how they were able to rent a house in that neighborhood. Yeah, also it's important to mention that she explained how this public space was very important for her. She would come every day with her daughter, and that's how she really got to build her social networks in the area. And just to wrap up, these are the emerging or identified themes that came out of these typological studies. So the first one is this evolving rural-urban identity, because you have very rapid, profound lifestyle shifts between generations, and you have farmers that are transitioning towards from farmers to industrial workers and also to entrepreneurs. And the floating population, which is drawn to the area, is introducing their own forms of spatial appropriation. And it's interesting to note especially for the older generations of villagers and migrants, that there was this connection between everyday practices, especially those who came from rural areas where they were still carrying out these sort of more rural-based everyday practices and farming activities, and that sort of connects them to one another. Productive dwelling, this refers to the fact that despite this new, very rigid functionalist environments, especially in the housing developments, you still have this intertwining of housing and productive practices, which is officially illegal, but it's really everywhere. And these household industries are really becoming part of regional informal production lines, and they're creating very crucial access to employment for the migrant workforce, especially those that don't have skills for a formal job. At the same time, the informal rental market that is existing there is creating new housing typologies and living arrangements. This informality is really tolerated from the top down. You have these, as I mentioned, these sort of adaptations or extensions of existing space. And at times, and they're really in view of everyone, you can really see them, but they have been often recognized as an opportunity for top down, for profit from the top down. So as I mentioned, these illegal workshops that are formalized by the village collectives to become official village enterprises. But this flexibility also enables the ability to accommodate different types of people from different types of regions and different types of skills. There was also very unequal agency within these processes. So these sort of physical and social mobilities, they're both, these transformations are providing both opportunities and risks, especially for the floating population. And it's also causing further stratifications within social groups themselves. And there seems to be a lot of process of negotiation going on between different actors, and this seems to be enabled by various resources, whether they're financial, personal networks, or labor skills or education. But these negotiative practices have become, or seem to have become, a very key factor in securing socioeconomic mobility in the area. So while some migrants show high adaptivity to the changes, others are unable to achieve upgrades to their living conditions and access to services. And lastly, there are varying degrees of integration. So they really depend on the migration background, whether it's rural to rural or rural to urban. The long working hours, lack of leisure time, for example, really make it more difficult for people to establish social connections and use public spaces. While the migrant families who have children tend to become more involved with the local communities. And language can be both an inclusive factor or inclusive factor as well. And to summarize everything, I went back to this multi-scalar framework and described these mobilities in these three levels of private, collective, and institutional. So at an institutional level, at a regional scale, the molding industry is transforming the villages, and their land is critical in providing for the industrial uses. And the villages are embedded informally and formally within these translocal production lines that are generating employment, attracting regional labor. At a collective scale, at a neighborhood scale, this informal local economy has been created through this productive households. And on a private level, at a family or individual scale, these everyday practices and social networks are playing a crucial role in placemaking and also socioeconomic mobility. And I think I will just end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava.